Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are sitting watching this webinar and listening in. My name is Rafael Ramirez. I'm sitting in Oxford. Steve and Alejandra are both in the UK, and Jonas is in France. We're very happy to welcome you to this webinar on using scenario planning to reshape strategy. The The four speakers are featured here, and we would be happy to be contacted after the webinar, either by email or by through the Oxford website to follow up with any of the aspects that we will cover in this webinar. The agenda that we have set is based on four big topics. First, I'm going to outline very quickly the Oxford scenario planning approach. For those of you that want to read more about it, we have the MIT Sloan Management Review article, which we co-authored and appeared in the summer of 2017 issue. You can open that in MIT Sloan Management Review. If you are not a subscriber, when they ask you for a subscription, you can click on becoming a member and you can download 3 articles for free. So we will cover that approach. It's also based in a book that I co-authored with my good colleague Angela Wilkinson, and we will cover that aspect. Then we will look at 3 actual case studies. Rolls Royce, where Steve Churchhouse was the director for digital until earlier this year. The Royal Society of Chemistry, which has had scenario planning done by Alejandra Palermo and her colleagues. She's the manager of external relationships currently, and work that Jonas Hoffman has been working on Swiss watchmaking. We will look at those 3 cases in terms of making scenario planning work and how they help to reframe strategy. And we plan to have about 20 or 25 minutes at the end of the session for Q&A for people that are listening in and that can send questions via email to us. The Oxford scenario planning approach was developed over many years by a whole group of people. The approach is taught by us in the Oxford Scenarios Planning program that just received the British Academy of Management Award for impact of business schools as of last week. We also run something called the Oxford Futures Forum, and the report of this year's forum can be downloaded from the web. And finally, the book I was mentioning with Angela Wilkinson, who has been instrumental in developing not only the approach but also the program, is available for sale. This particular webinar is based on the paper that was written by Steve, Alejandra, Jonas, and myself, and published in this summer's MIT issue. Basically, as is stated in the book with Angela, the approach works in contexts where organizations and their managers are experiencing some combination of totally novel circumstances, such as the current debate as to whether face recognition technology is going to be ethical or not, and the extent to which it's reliable. Unpredictable uncertainty, which is a type of uncertainty that is impossible to forecast. Ambiguity, example of ambiguity at the moment is thanks to the Dieselgate scandal, is what does made in Germany really stand for? Does it stand for superb engineering and quality, or does it stand for cheating? And finally, and not least, turbulence, which is a technical term, we'll come back to that, of situations where the expected future is not happening as was planned for, and some alternative future is either beginning to unfold or is already unfolding, and it overtakes one's assumptions and makes one feel less competent to deal with things than was expected. So tuna conditions are the conditions in which scenario planning is helpful. The approach is based on this distinction that we make between the more immediate environment surrounding a particular actor or manager or management team or company or government department, which we call the transactional environment. Many people call it the business environment. It's made up of actors with whom you can interact and whom you can influence and with whom you can co-design things, versus the wider set of factors that are beyond the influence of the central actor. And these can come together and transform the transactional environment and therefore question the way in which the actor is seeing roles there and engaging with these people and organizations. A lot of the work we are doing at the moment is about collaborating with other players, and we'll see that both in the Rolls Royce case and in the Royal Society of Chemistry case, and we will see the lack of this collaboration at the moment in the Swiss watchmaking field. And the idea is that if you can collaborate with others, you can create a slightly larger actor, and by becoming a bigger actor, you can move the boundary between the transactional environment and the contextual environment to stabilize things a bit and therefore to regain your adaptive capacity and your capacity to do well in strategy. Now I'm going to pass the word on to our colleague Steve, who will walk us through the Rolls Royce case. Steve was employed in Rolls Royce for 33 years. They nabbed him early on in his life, and he just stepped down from that role earlier this year. Steve, over to you.
Hi, thanks for the introduction, Raphael. So yes, 35 years at Rolls Royce. I'm going to say a little bit about how scenario planning has now made it into the Rolls Royce strategic planning process. So next slide, please. So a little bit about the context of how scenario planning arose. So it's fair to say that in about 2014, early 2014, the company ran into difficulties. And every so often this happens to large companies, but it was clear that this was really quite an extraordinary set of circumstances for Rolls Royce. So every one of the different Rolls Royce businesses was impacted. The wide body airliners order cycle peaked. It's a capital goods market. It goes through cycles, so nothing extraordinary about that. The commodities boom came to an end, or the commodities super cycle came to an end, and that impacted our business jet market because very wealthy people who were making a lot of money in Australia, the Far East, China, India, Russia, after the commodities boom, suddenly found they had less surplus cash. Now, then the oil price collapsed as well. Now, that impacted our marine business because most of our marine business is in the sort of niche, very high technology offshore oil exploration. And then our energy exploration business, where we support the oil and gas exploration businesses with equipment for fracking and such like, clearly also tanked with the oil price down at $50 a barrel. And the nuclear industry, frankly, never really recovered from Fukushima. So our civil nuclear business was also very badly hit. So all these things hit at once. It was a perfect storm. And these kind of tuna conditions that Raphael alluded to earlier just overwhelmed our classic business forecasting and planning mechanisms. And at the time, I was director of corporate planning. I was head of the chief financial officer's planning staff. And it's fair to say we were all at sea.
Steve, this is Raphael. This is Raphael here. Can you give us an example in these tuna conditions of turbulence, unpredictable uncertainty, novelty, and ambiguity in Rolls Royce? Just an example for each, just to get people.
Well, so it was novel. So we had a portfolio architecture in which we kind of assumed that all of the it wouldn't be the case that all the businesses would go down at once. So this was a novel circumstance. We were used to the wide body orders are cyclical, heavily cyclical. So big airlines orders in, and Boeing and Airbus produce aircraft in very big batches. So the industry turns down every so often. But it was very novel for every single business to turn down at once. The uncertainty came. So the next thing is, would the oil price turn back up? Right? Really, no one could tell. And there was typically when you get an oil price crash, then the oil industry goes through a destocking cycle, and then you get a kind of V shape on the oil price, and it immediately comes back again in a couple of years' time. You just have to ride it out. But the fracking industry basically put a ceiling on the price of oil at about $50 a barrel. And some commentators, such as Goldman Sachs, for instance, were telling us that oil price would never go back up again. Nevertheless, the Saudi Arabians and the OPEC guys had made a big bet on that the oil price would go back up again. So we were completely uncertain. The ambiguity came. Well, there was a lot of ambiguity in the commercial position of the company. You'll see further down. There was a lot of ambiguity around the management team. You go down to the second to last bullet. Third last bullet. So we issued 5 profit warnings. The share price halved, and the CEO and the CFO departed. So there was an enormous amount of turbulence as well in the leadership. So the company internally was very turbulent, and an activist investor came in, acquired more than 10% of the equity. It was ambiguous whether the company would even survive. So ambiguity about something as important as survival, at least in its current form, because there's lots of talk about the company being broken up, and that's why the activist investor came in. There was definitely that rumor. There was turbulence within the company, let alone in the external environments. No one knew what was happening to commodity prices. No one knew what was happening to the oil price. It seemed to fit this classic tuna definition.
Good.
So obviously we started to gather ourselves together a bit. We got a new CEO in July 2015, Warren East, who clearly was going to apply a new brooms to the situation. And just simultaneously, the senior leaders, myself included, we embarked on a new new form of executive education at Oxford site, and that was remarkable. Opened our eyes to a lot of opportunities and learning, and a few of us were really quite struck by the whole experience and decided that we were going to do something different. Whatever happened, we were going to do something different. We weren't going to just go on a course and sit back and not put it into action. So next slide, please.
Got it. You with us, Steve?
So yes. So and I think this was important, is that somebody right at the top of the company decided to champion scenario planning activity. And there was a couple of things that we took away from that course. Branding was another one, and a couple of other things. But scenario planning really struck people. And the then Chief Strategy Officer, the CEO's Chief Strategy Officer, and I was in the finance organisation. I was working for the CFO at the time. But we kind of banded together and decided, right, we're going to make something change. So I think that was important. You need the senior sponsor. So the CSO became the senior sponsor. And we gathered together about 25 mid to senior level guys and gals from across the company, various different business units, functions, geographies, to basically resource the process. If I had a criticism of that, we didn't really invite in as many external voices as we should have done. We had a few external voices, but probably not enough in retrospect. So we worked closely with Oxford Said. We each participant went away and researched one of about 40 topics. I think we had 40 in the end. So I think some people took more than one topic, which we thought might be relevant to the future of Rolls Royce. But there was a very broad set of topics, like, I don't know, what might nanotechnology have to offer Rolls Royce in the future, or what might the future, how might the future of Moore's law change over the next 3 decades? Does it matter that there's a distinction between values that are fake and values that are real? Well, so some really quite off-the-wall topics, and it was not the implication that the participants were intended to be expert. So after that period, which took place over Christmas 2016, Christmas 2015, 2016, in early 2016, we gathered together for a 3-day workshop, and we basically went through a sequence of both group work and plenary work to create multiple trial scenarios. And we basically coalesced the 3 scenarios down to 3 scenarios in the end, which and the only requirement was they had to be plausible, relevant, and challenging to Rolls-Royce. And the 3 scenarios we came up with, which I note I haven't actually written in the slides here, but they're in the paper, is one was a world based on high connectivity, so in which technology would basically connect everyone on the planet, and IP would move seamlessly, intellectual property would move, and learning would move seamlessly around the planet. Another world was one where there'd been basically breakdown in the political world order. The world would basically divide into power blocks. We postulated a North American bloc, a Chinese Far Eastern bloc, and a South Asian bloc led by India. And then the third world was one which was digitally divided, which was kind of a dark world in which the new technologies would basically sharply divide the haves and the have-nots, and there would probably be some degree of social unrest as wealth became very extremely divided between people like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and the rest of us. So those scenarios were documented, and then they were used then by the board in and their annual strategy review process, which took place later in 2016. So what did we gain from this? So we gained an understanding of why our classic forecasting process was really not working. So in schooner conditions, a classic forecasting process really isn't that helpful. The scenario planning became a primary tool used through our strategic planning process in 2016, and again in 2017. And I know some of the guys from Rolls Royce are on the call now who used it in anger, still are using it at the moment. Some specific improvements. Now, all capital investments made by the company now are tested specifically against the scenarios. And in terms of making investments, the scenarios kind of legitimize concerns and fears and issues which otherwise wouldn't make a nice, neat business case. Some things don't make a nice, neat business case, but they're still true. And the scenarios have given us a really good framework for sort of understanding how these uncertain events, these ambiguous and these novel events unfold. But now we can actually place them on the axis of one of our scenarios, and it kind of helps make sense of the world. And finally, quite a lot of the ideas that we thought would be weak signals or indicators for the 2040 world have actually come true already in just 18 months. So I guess another piece of learning is we really weren't bold enough in terms of what we thought, a 2040 world might look like.
Thanks very much, Steve. We'll hold it there in the interest of time. I'll pass the word to the other colleagues, sure. And then if there are questions from our listeners, we can field them to you. Thanks very much. This is now the Royal Society of Chemistry. This slide is from their website. You can download a whole report with their scenarios that was authored by Alejandra. Alejandra, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rafael. In contrast to the Royal Society, the Rolls-Royce, where the aim of the scenario planning process was to imagine future directions for one organization, at the Royal Society of Chemistry, our goal was much wider. Our aim was to understand how the chemical sciences might evolve over the next 10 to 20 years and how the changes might impact in industry, academia, and society at large. So our scope was both externally and internally focused. We wanted not only to guide the chemistry community as they look strategically into the future, but also to help the community and ourselves, the Royal Society of Chemistry, to take more proactive decisions today. Perhaps an important question to answer is why the Royal Society of Chemistry has undertaken such initiative. And as Rafael mentioned before, and as well as Steve, our world is today undergoing tuna conditions, and of course, they also affect the chemical sciences. And these changing conditions have affected not only the nature and practice of chemistry, but also the role of the chemists. However, chemistry continues to play a very important role in solving the problems that society faces today, from curing disease to developing sustainable energy, to providing food security and clean water to all, and of course in creating new industries, products and services. But as chemistry faces new opportunities and obligations to society, the fundamental question that we at the Royal Society of Chemistry posed to ourselves and to the community was, how should we think about the future of chemistry? But let me go a bit into more detail about the Royal Society of Chemistry, which will perhaps provide a better context of our initiative. We are a non-for-profit membership and professional body with the mission of advancing excellence in the chemical sciences for the benefit of science and humanity. And we are one of the oldest learned societies in the world. And we are over 175 years, but we have grown a great deal since then, and we have more than 55,000 members across the world with many offices outside the UK. And we are one of the largest non-commercial publishers in the world of chemistry and an influential champion for our field. So clearly, what we wish to continue to be is a successful organization that is relevant to the communities that we represent. So in this, because that's the reason that we started in 2014, we launched this Futures Initiative. And although the initiative didn't refer initially to a scenario planning per se, the aim of the initiative was to identify possible future directions for chemistry and to anticipate, plan, prepare, or how the field might evolve. So what we did at the beginning was identifying some big questions for the leadership to consider, the leadership of the Royal Society of Chemistry. So some of the questions are those ones they are presented on the slide. Could chemistry be facing a future in which academic chemistry departments disappear? What would happen if public funding is not available to support blue sky research that has traditionally produced main discoveries? How will future research be funded then? How will the phenomenal advances in science and in technology and computation techniques change the way we do chemistry, with the way we teach chemistry? In a nutshell, the overall question that we were posing was, how might the identity of chemistry be changing? And of course, as in any organization, we looked for consensus across the RSC and tried to capitalize on the internal knowledge that we hold. So we began by convening a one-day workshop for the leadership team and selected senior managers across the organization. And this workshop helped the senior staff to focus on the importance of taking a comprehensive look at how the field was changing and to begin to define the new role that the RSC could play in the future. We then developed a multi-stage scenario planning program. And during the first phase, which ran for approximately 3 months, we interviewed a number of stakeholders from industry, government, and academia to identify possible trends. And we then ran or follow-up face-to-face interviews with some of the stakeholders in order to understand controversial perspectives, or in some cases to secure buy-in from key leaders in the chemical sciences. And during this process, we identified 7 themes. And some of the themes identified had a direct relationship with the chemical sciences. For example, the increasing importance of interdisciplinarity and the changes in funding of research. Other themes that were raised were of wider remit, but affected chemistry equally importantly, such as how technology might influence the chemical industry, the changes on intellectual property, the social factors, and so forth. And based on these 7 themes, we then ran 3 scenario planning workshops to help us identify weak signals that might emerge as important catalysts of future change. And with all this information, the RSC then was able to develop 4 challenging scenarios for the future of the chemical sciences. And the first scenario, with the graph on the top right figure, focused on the benefits that chemistry brings to the world and its ability to provide answers to global challenges such as climate change, water shortages, natural resources, scarcity, and healthcare for an aging population, and how in this scenario, chemistry managed to highlight its role on discovery. The second scenario, bottom right, focus on changes in the way chemistry is done and how it is organized, foreseeing a world where the chemical sciences are increasingly automated and decentralized, a world where perhaps chemistry becomes a commodity. The third scenario, bottom left, spoke to the growing separation of chemistry into subdisciplines and explore how that might negatively impact the pipeline of future chemists. The fourth scenario, top left, explored the impact of reduced public funding for the chemical sciences and perhaps those ones that becomes the new funders of science in the world. Next slide. These scenarios helped to develop the Royal Society of Chemistry long-term strategy and also to challenge leaders in the chemical sciences to move beyond conventional thinking and start to plan for the future. And we continue to encourage the chemistry community to reflect on opportunities and challenges. The key to success in this context is creating occasions that can enable strategic conversations with the community and for the community. And we have been doing that since then. We published the report, as Rafael mentioned, with the findings, and they are freely available. And the aim of this report was opening up the engagement with chemistry leaders and future leaders, but also with other relevant arenas and other areas. We're also committed to bring the RSC future thinking conversation to a wider audience. So we are keen in talking to all our international partners around the world. And more closely to us, to the RSC, we're increasing the internal strategic conversations with the senior management and the RSC's external governing body so that we can analyze and prepare for the possible futures. We also started new activities based on the scenarios. For instance, the future of scholarly communication is something that we are looking at. And we are doing this because of the consistent developments in open access, in publishing, and the trends in open science. Finally, each element of our new strategy has been tested against the opportunities and the challenges that were identified through the scenario planning work. But perhaps the most important thing to say is that not only this project, the Futures Initiative, not only influence our strategic decisions today and the ones that we develop our strategy, but also we have to continue revisit what we have done, and it's the beginning of the process. Revisit, review, and test check is important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jonas, tell us about what's happening in Swiss watchmaking.
Self-muted. He's forgotten.
Yeah, that's okay. My mic was on mute. Sorry for that. This is part of a research project that I have the pleasure to engage with you, Rafael, and I had the pleasure to spend a year working with you at Oxford University, and basically try to understand, and that's interesting, the link with the Royal Society of Chemistry, how at the level of a field, and in this case we are talking about the Swiss watchmaking field, how field enters turbulence and how the actors in this field react. So this is slide, and you can see lots of logos here and there. Basically, you have a number of actors that you can qualify as the incumbents in the Swiss watchmaking field. So you'll have a group like Richemont, owner of brands like Cartier, like Montblanc, like IWC. You'll have the major incumbent in the Swiss watchmaking field, the Swatch Group, owner, of course, of Swatch, but as well of more high-end brands like Breguet, like Harry Winston, as well as Omega and Tissot. And then LVMH, the world largest luxury group based in France, but owner of a number of companies in Switzerland as well. Companies like Hublot, like Tag Heuer, and as well Bulgari. And then you have companies that are family owned, like Patek Philippe. You also have a Rolex, which is a kind of particular kind of company, if we can call like that. So those are the incumbents in this field. And then you have a number of challengers, and I have presented cases of these companies in two of my previous books. You could add a company like Richard Mille in the very high end as well. And then you have a bit like the Royal Society of Chemistry. You have an organization like the Swiss Watch Federation that basically lobbies for the whole field in terms of fighting counterfeits and other elements. And then you have a number, of course, of other organizations that are in the field. You have the banks, you have government, you have media, you have the organizer of the main events like the trade fairs like Basel World. So you have a number of players. And basically our study, that is a working paper we are working on, shows how in a specific time in the past 5 years, how the field entering turbulence in tuna conditions, and how just now it's slowly recovering from that period. And that basically, you had a number of factors hitting the field. Chief among those factors is the anti-graft campaign. Basically, after the great financial crisis back in 2008, there was a deep dive in terms of sales of Swiss watches, but very quick it recovered, fueled by Chinese demand. And Swiss watches were a main gift that was used in China. And that basically, there was a kind of golden moment for 3 years, 2009, even 2009, 2012, where demand was in double-digit growth and in exceptional demand. And that made actors take decisions in terms of expanding capacity and as well committing to real estate investments, especially in China and Asia. And basically, when the Xi Jinping came to office back in 2012, there was a promise on that sense. I was there in Shanghai at that moment, and no one really took seriously that promise that basically there will be a strong campaign against that kind of gift. So that is, it started to happen in 2013, and then early 2015 there was a Swiss franc revaluation. There was a peg between the euro and the Swiss franc, and that basically stopped it. So in the very high end, that made a strong hit in companies that were playing the high-end watches above 5,000, above 10,000 euros, Swiss francs or British pounds. And then what also happened is that in the low end of the market, for companies like Swatch and others, there was the emergence of a new field of, from one side, health and fitness trackers. Fitbit is the paramount example there, connected watches, but in particular, and that in the past 2 years, is smart watches, and then the Apple Watch as a big player. And right now, Apple is presenting the next, let's say, since they launched that 2 years ago, today they're going to unveil the new Apple Watch, and there are hopes that this is going to give a new boost, because basically there was a strong trend in wearables, and that basically a bit faded out. So there was this turbulence, those turbulent conditions that the field faced, and very interesting, and that's the point of my research with Raphael, is that we saw that in a very turbulent condition, one option could be for actors to engage and collaborate, but basically, due to the fragmented nature of the field, what happened is that basically each actor played by itself. And that eventually made the turbulence to reinforce. And so the field faced an even stronger turbulence. And if you can just click once more, there will be a chart that should appear in the bottom. And basically what happened last year, but that has as well been the case in 15, very precarious conditions last year. Basically you had, well, maybe you can visualize the chart. It's from January to 16, the exports, that's the only reliable indicator. We have about Swiss watch sales, and basically -4, -6, -8, -10 every month in terms of exports. So a field entering turbulence, and when we discuss with many actors in the field, basically this difficulty to work together, and our interrogation was, but could scenario planning help? And that remains a major question. And what we observe is that unless there is an organization trying to push for more what we call collaborative strategy, you may end up in improving turbulence, as it was the case now. The field sales are now recovering, but that's pretty much because the Chinese demand is back. But some fundamentals remain very compromised in the situation.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pass just a couple of summary slides and then open up the field for questions from our listeners. For us in the Oxford approach to scenario planning, we really need to attend explicitly to what is framed in and what is framed out. It's clear from the Rolls Royce case that they had framed out the possibility that oil would oil price would decrease and stay low, and this would have all kinds of effects on the demand in all of their sectors, coupled with a number of things that were not related to the oil price but happened at the same time, more or less in terms of their strategy, the Fukushima nuclear accident and all of its implications for their nuclear activities, the lateness in pulling out new airliners for both Airbus and Boeing. All of that created situations that had been framed out of their context. The work that Alejandra and her colleagues did was to frame in all kinds of possibilities that had been left out of the field, where perhaps a lot of what chemists have been doing up to now will be done by biologists in the future, or by robots, or by computers. And certainly the case of the watchmaking field shows that the mechanical watchmaking that has been at the core of the top end has not taken into account what a connected device on your wrist might do to that business. So we look at what is framed in and what is framed out in strategy and use scenarios to question those frames. We use a limited number of scenarios because we only have limited capacities as human beings. We cannot take 400 scenarios in our heads without going crazy. And as our book with Angela shows, we have to do this in an iterative way, in a number of iterations. That was certainly the case in Rolls Royce, where they did a set of scenarios and then they revisited them and then dropped some, merged some, and eventually came up with 3 that were useful. One important thing that has worked very well both in the Royal Society of Chemistry and Rolls Royce is that people were very happy to consider themselves to be learners. And perhaps one of the blockers in the Swiss watch field is that some of the key people that ought to be learning have decided that they don't need to learn, or don't want to learn, or are not ready to learn. So for us, it is clear that scenario planning works well when you are planning to be a learner, and being a learner is part of your strategic planning. And perhaps we can come back as to how that contrasts with traditional modes of planning. Finally, the scenario planning does open you to be attentive to weak signals, and as Steve said, things that they thought would happen later, they started happening earlier. Whether they were really happening earlier or they just attended to the fact that they were happening already, we can discuss. But certainly scenario planning helps you to attend to weak signals, and that's something that the Swiss watchmakers have not been able to do in time. In terms of reframing strategy, we know that we have to invest time and effort, even if you're in a crisis. I was very impressed with the amount of energy that people in a real crisis during the Rolls Royce scenario planning over Christmas and New Year's, with a lot of their colleagues being laid off and themselves not knowing whether they would be laid off, the effort and time they put into preparing these factor analysis. We help people to assess their assumptions, and we do believe that it's an iterative process. So one of the interesting things in the Royal Society case and in the Rolls Royce case is what kind of iterations both organizations plan to do in the future. We look at very big issues. I'm not going to detain myself too much on this, but it's not just that we look at each issue, we look at how those issues would relate to each other and then how they impact the business environment that we're in. We're now going to move to the Q&A session, and I'm waiting here for my colleagues to send us a couple of questions which I will pass on to some of our colleagues. There's a question here. I can see how scenario planning was useful in these cases, but what's new in the approach? The 2012 Shell scenario celebrated 40 years. Somebody used it when he was working there. What having looked at scenario planning at the field level, can you, Alejandra and perhaps Jonas, quickly tell us what is different from conducting scenario planning in Shell, which after all is a big company like Rolls Royce, from conducting scenario planning at the field level? Alejandra?
Yes, I think that's a very important question, Rafael. I think the main difference is that in each one of the stages of the scenario planning work, you have to engage with the community. You cannot do it only within the leadership team and the senior staff within the organization that you're working with. So you have to involve the community. And that's why at the Royal Society of Chemistry, we established a multi-stage process. And in each one of those stages, we involved the community. We didn't do one scenario planning workshop. We ran 3 scenario planning workshops. And before we publicized the scenarios themselves, when we finished all the process, we came up with 4 scenarios. We then started a dialogue, a conversation with some of the key stakeholders before going open to the community, to the world. We really wanted to have the consensus from the community that what we're doing was the right thing and that it was going to be useful. And just to add one more point, I think, as you always say, Rafael, scenarios have to be useful. Otherwise, there is no point of having scenarios. They have to be useful in guiding some strategic conversation or leading to new strategies. And in order to be useful for the community, you have to engage with them.
Is the community that was put together for the scenario planning in any way different from the community that you use on an everyday basis as external affairs? Was there any difference in the community you engaged for the scenario planning than in the community you was engaged for other reasons?
I will say it's the same community. Is that identifying those individuals within the community that have that overview or that have that wider view about what chemistry or what the future of the chemistry could be or how could it look like. It's identifying those individuals that have that strategic view about chemistry, about science. But that doesn't mean it's about seniority. It's about those individuals that have that sort of overview.
Okay. What about the difficulties of getting that community together in the watchmaking field, Jonas?
One interesting point is that you need to have a mandate at the level of that organization that could organize, and that was clearly the case in the Royal Society of Chemistry, and that mandate was lacking in the discussions we engaged with the Swiss watchmaking field. And there was one of the reasons was that the turbulence, tuna conditions may favor some actors. Some very large incumbents, basically, for them, there was an interest in that a conversation like that will not take place at the collective level, since they could engage the conversation themselves. But more than that, I guess what's interesting to observe at the field level is the whole idea, and that's what we explore in our paper, Rafael, is the idea of how a certain frame basically frames a field. And as you mentioned before, the idea that the mechanical movement was a definition of what Swiss watchmakings are about, and that's something that came to be. It has not been always the case like that. How that frame basically makes that actors don't take actions. That's what to explore at the field level scenario planning.
Okay, thank you very much. Steve, there's one for you here. There's a question that has been sent as to whether you waited too long and did scenario planning in a crisis. That's very different from the way that Shell traditionally says it has done things, where it has thought ahead of the crisis and been prepared. And the question was, first of all, should you have done it before and to try to avert the crisis? And second, given that you were in a crisis, how did that affect your practice of scenario planning? Steve?
Right. I've just been unmuted, thanks. So I think that's a very valid point. I think it took a crisis, if I'm going to be very honest, right? It took a crisis to shake Rolls Royce out of its complacency about its existing strategic planning process, which was very complicated, like Rolls Royce really, like the product's very complicated, very elegant, very high technology, but very optimized for a certain set of conditions. I'm talking about the strategic planning process. But of course, the tuna conditions completely moved the environment to a place where the strategic planning process just couldn't cope. So I think the implicit criticism in the question is correct. We should have been doing this, in the years before the crisis. But unfortunately, I think it took the crisis to legitimize what we probably all knew about our strategic planning process in the first place, which is that it was, just too complex, too single point focused, and too much about forecasting and not actually enough about making strategic choices. So the crisis legitimized the change. So it basically took the crisis to shake us out of our complacency. Now, how did the crisis actually impact the execution? Well, I guess as soon as the CSO, Chief Strategy Officer, and myself had decided that we were going to do it, I guess the crisis actually helped, because there was a sense of urgency that we would get on with it and we would do something. So in that sense, which is kind of Rolls Royce culture at its best, is that when there is a crisis, it really does galvanize people into action. So in that sense, the crisis actually helped.
Okay, thank you. A question for you, Alejandra. There's a question from somebody that works in a non-profit organization, such as the Royal Society. And the question is whether your having done scenario planning in any way changed the culture and values of the society. And a related question that somebody else asked is, how would you know? How would you go about assessing the effect that this has had on, for example, the culture and values of the society?
Okay, that's a good question. First of all, it's the Royal Society of Chemistry, Rafael. I think, yes, we do. We follow up. One of the points I was mentioning is that the Royal Society of Chemistry new strategy has been tested against the opportunities and the challenges that we identify through the scenario planning work. And we identify new priorities for the future. And one of those, for instance, is to amplify the voice of the chemistry community. And we have ideas on how to go about this. And those were definitely identified through the scenario planning work. And I think it's how we test if what we are doing is the right thing. I think is identifying those emerging trends and continue to follow those trends in the future, how they evolve. Is it in the way that they evolve in the way that we are perceiving they moving into through the scenarios we identify, or is it in a different orientation, a different way? I think that's one way to check the probability or the plausibility of the scenarios. The other way is talking with our communities. So one of the things that we have been doing throughout 2017 is going out and talking and presenting the scenarios work and having workshops, panel discussions. Our president is going to different communities and talking about the future of the chemical sciences and the scenarios developed and getting feedback on what are the new opportunities that we can actually embark together with the community. I don't know if that's covered the question, Rafael.
That's helpful. Steve, for you and your colleagues at Rolls Royce, how would you assess the value of scenario planning? One of the questions that we've received is, was the value much more in the process and in the learning, or was the scenario set and its use in strategy more valuable? And how would you compare the value of those? So there's two questions. Where is the value? Is it in the process or is it in the result and the results use? And the second one is, how would you go about assessing the value of doing scenario planning in a situation such as yours?
So this is my personal opinion, obviously, but I think the real value, the real value that you can actually get hold of at the moment is in the process and the learning. So it was, I mean, you alluded to it earlier, Raphael, and this was a broader outtake of the entire executive education process that the senior leadership went through at SBS, Site Business School, is that it opened our eyes to the fact that although we at Rolls Royce, you know, okay, so we think we're the best engineering company in the world, and maybe we are, but that breeds a certain NIH not invented here, and the process basically opened our eyes to how much learning there was and how much new thinking there was that we could bring into our strategic planning process. So I think the main value so far has been in the learning and how we now use the scenarios to go throughout the company to educate people about, well, just look at the world. The world is actually a much more complicated and turbulent place than you think it is. Now, it will take years for to test whether the second half of the question or the second question actually comes true, okay? Because the kind of investments and change processes that you have to put in place in a company like Rolls-Royce in order to change the strategy are immense and unfold over a period of many years. So I guess we'll look back in 2040 if we're still here and know whether the process generated a lot of value in that sense.
Okay. There's a question from a person working as a scenario planner in a large legal firm. And the question is whether it's going to become more difficult to get scenario planning going in a situation like the Royal Society of Chemistry or Rolls-Royce or, of course, the watchmaking field, which has not, to our knowledge, undertaken it, as turbulence becomes more pronounced, or whether more turbulence makes it harder. Now, if I go back to your story, Alejandra, where you didn't start out with turbulence, you started out looking at the future of the chemical sciences, and in looking at the future of chemical sciences, encountered that you were in an emerging turbulent situation and then did scenario planning. That would suggest that some turbulence is a good invitation for scenario planning. But the extreme case is Rolls-Royce, which had lost more than half of its value and its CFO and its CEO and was in real trouble. And it was in very extreme turbulence, and you still did scenario planning. Any comments about whether there could be too much scenario planning too much turbulence to do scenario planning, or if scenario planning is quote unquote easier to do because of the turbulence? Steve?
Well, I think for Rolls Royce, it was the turbulence legitimised a radically new approach to career. Without the turbulence, I think we'd have just continued with a very incrementalist single point forecasting view of the world without undertaking the scenario planning. So I think in the Rolls Royce case, the extreme turbulence, which is more than turbulence, it was a crisis, as you said. We lost half of our share value, and a lot of senior guys. I think the turbulence actually legitimised and gave position to the scenario planning activity. I mean, if I can take a slightly critical view on the sort of body of work of scenario planning that I see in other companies, a lot of it looks like it might just be window dressing and just going through the motions, because having a nice set of scenarios is a nice thing to do. So sometimes a little bit of crisis, or certainly a little bit of turbulence, I think is a good thing because it pricks you into action.
Okay, I'm just attentive of the clock here. Any last comments from Jonas or Alejandra before we close? Jonas, any news?
I just wanted to say, Rafael, that I think that what Steve has captured exactly what I wanted to say. Scenario planning in turbulent times are really helpful. They really try to help you in challenge your current thinking, and that's for me the beauty of the scenario planning work.
And they will complete to that exactly that basically, and I've been seeing a number of examples I'm working currently now. Tuna conditions give that sense of urgency to move ahead, and move ahead in that kind of uncertainty scenarios are one of the best techniques, if not the only, to really move ahead in those conditions.
Okay. Well, I thank you very much for attending our webinar. It will be posted online very soon. And for more information on our program, there is something here on the last slide. And if you do want to get in touch with any of the speakers, please get in touch with us and we will relay your email. Thank you very much and have a good evening or good morning or good night, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.